You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thanks for joining Revolution 250, where we look at events that took place 250 years ago this week. This is from the American Revolution Podcast, a short bonus episode to remind you about these important anniversaries from the Revolutionary War. This week, we remember the launch of the Continental Navy on its first mission. The fleet left Philadelphia on February 17th, 1776. The Continental Congress had authorized a Continental Navy back in October of 1775. Our real Navy was more of a dream than a reality. Aside from the ships that Benedict Arnold had captured on Lake Champlain and a handful of ships that George Washington had purchased or rented, which remained under Army control, the Continental Congress had no ships. Several colonies had launched their own ships, mostly to attack and capture merchant ships supplying the regulars. Many privateers were raiding British ships as well. This was actually quite helpful in capturing supplies and denying them to the British Army, but none of this was under the command of Congress, and no colony nor privateer had anything that could go up against a British naval fleet or even one of the larger ships of the line. That didn't seem to discourage anyone. Congress decided to start building a navy and wanted to put it to use as soon as possible. Congressional delegate Esek Hopkins of Rhode Island sat on the Naval Committee. When it came time to select a fleet commander, Stephen thought his brother, Esek Hopkins, would be the best man for the job. He got Congress to appoint Esek Hopkins as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Navy. During the French and Indian War, Hopkins had captained a privateer ship, capturing numerous French and Spanish ships as prizes. The fact that they were not actually at war with Spain at the time didn't seem to bother anyone, except the Spanish, I guess. Hopkins grew even wealthier from all the prize money. During the 1760s, Hopkins was elected to several minor posts in Rhode Island, although he seemed to resign them all after short periods, presumably because he returned to sea. His involvement in government probably came about more by the fact that his brother Stephen Hopkins was governor of Rhode Island for much of the 1750s and 1760s. By the early 1770s, Esek was in his 50s and ready to spend more time at home. He served in the Colonial Assembly and clearly sided with the Patriots as the split with Britain grew. In 1772, his son was a leader in the force that sank the British ship the Gaspé. Now, the term Navy might be a bit much for what Commodore Hopkins commanded. Individual colonies did not want to give up the ships that they had outfitted to defend their own coastlines and harass British shipping. Privateers were in no hurry to join a navy where they would have to take orders from someone else and not be allowed to keep as much prize money as they currently enjoyed. So Congress spent much of the winter of 1775-76 purchasing merchant vessels and outfitting them as best they could to serve as combat vessels. Congress had authorized building more ships, but they were nowhere near ready in early 1776 when Commodore Hopkins received his first orders to set sail. At the time, his fleet consisted of 8 ships. The largest, the Columbus, with 36 guns. The next largest, the flagship Alfred, had 24 guns, followed by the 16-gun Cabot, the 14-gun Andrea Doria, and the 12-gun Providence. The 3 smallest ships, the 10-gun Hornet, the Wasp, and the Fly, with 8 guns each, were named after insects, supposedly because they were so small they could only serve as a nuisance to the enemy in battle. By comparison, a British ship of the line had at least 60 guns, and there were at least 130 ships of the line in the British Navy at the time. The small fleet left Philadelphia in February 1776. British General Henry Clinton was headed south at the same time. Clinton had a contingent of British ships to meet up with General Cornwallis and another fleet. That combined British fleet planned to capture the Carolinas and restore Tory control of those colonies. You may recall that Lord Dunmore in Virginia had burned Norfolk in January and remained with another British fleet controlling the Chesapeake Bay, operating out of Portsmouth, Virginia. There was also a fleet up around Boston and another one up in Canada. Any of those fleets individually were more than a match for the 8 ships and 130 Marines commanded by Hopkins. Dunmore had at least 6 naval vessels, most of which were larger than anything the Continentals had, and he also had at least 400 Marines. Clinton and Cornwallis's fleets consisted of dozens of ships and thousands of soldiers. In just about any confrontation, the best-case scenario for the Continental Navy would be to run away successfully and not be sunk or captured. And despite the odds, Congress instructed Hopkins to go forth and take out the British Navy. His first mission was to take his fleet to the Chesapeake Bay and take out the naval fleet there. After winning that fight, he should proceed immediately to the Carolinas and take out the huge fleet off the coast, which was probably 20 times the size of his fleet. After defeating them, Hopkins was to proceed north and take out the fleet at Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island. They even authorized him to break up his fleet of 8 ships and send them in different directions in order to cover more territory. While they were at it, I'm not sure why they just didn't order him to sail over to London and capture the king. These orders were so out of touch with reality that Hopkins must have shaken his head in disbelief. Congress also, however, granted Hopkins the authority to use his best judgment if weather or other unforeseen accidents made his primary mission impossible. On February 17th, Hopkins took his fleet out of Philadelphia and out toward the open seas. Departure had been delayed several weeks because the Delaware River was still frozen and the fleet couldn't get out. As the ship set sail, Hopkins instructed Lieutenant John Paul Jones to hoist the new flag, a yellow flag with a rattlesnake on it and the phrase, "Don't tread on me." South Carolina delegate Christopher Gadsden had taken a copy of this flag home to South Carolina, and that was how the fleet and the defenders of Charleston Harbor would recognize each other as friends if the fleet made it there. This flag is often known as the Gadsden flag. Now, apparently Hopkins decided even before he left Philadelphia that his orders were impossible to fulfill and that he darn well planned to use his own best judgment. He could have discussed this with committee members before leaving, but instead he simply pocketed his orders and did his own thing. Before leaving port, Hopkins issued orders to each captain that if they became separated from the fleet, they should rendezvous at a small island called Abaco in the Bahamas, which seems really out of the way, like over 700 miles out of the way, for raids on the Chesapeake or the Carolinas. Instead of sailing after the British fleets, Hopkins sailed his Continental fleet down to the Bahamas, where he opted to conduct a raid on the capital at Nassau. I hope you've enjoyed this Revolution 250 moment. For more context on the events discussed today, check out episode 84 of the American Revolution podcast. You can listen to it at blog.amrevpodcast.com. Also, please subscribe for free on whatever podcast platform you like. Thanks again for listening to this Revolution 250 moment on the American Revolution podcast.